have no idea how I'm, oh, jeez. Thank you.
Yep.
I will name those organizations.
You want to name those?
No, that's okay.
I'm perfectly fine to go with you on that. So I want to start with Losing Absalom. And that's Alex's first novel. In Losing Absalom, because his father is dying, Absalom is dying, Sonny Goodman leaves his middle-class life in the Twin Cities to return to Philadelphia, to the Philadelphia neighborhood he grew up in. A neighborhood he feels in some ways he has escaped, and others feels guilty about escaping. It's a black neighborhood that, like in many cities during the 1980s, is feeling the effects of the drug trade, a shift in its economic makeup, and traditional black working class stability. Near the end of the novel, Sonny has a confrontation with his sister's boyfriend, Dancer, who is described in this way. To Dancer, there were only two types of black people, those who had hope and those who didn't. Anybody who had was a punk. That's how he imagines Sonny. So, can you speak a bit about Losing Absalom? I'm highlighting here a few things from the book. First, there's Sonny's ambiguous feelings about having moved from North Philly to the Twin Cities, the deep sense of guilt he carries about his middle-class success, which in part depended upon, or in his mind depended upon, his leaving Philly and his family. Second, there's the way the neighborhood that he grew up in is changing. And third, there's Dancer's division of black people who have hope and black people who don't.
First of all, let me say, again, thank you for inviting me to be here. It wasn't coerced. There was no quid pro quo. And for that introduction, which almost robs me of my voice in a way. I also want to say that it's about a week ago or so, John A. Williams passed away. He wrote The Man Who Cried I Am. I was lucky enough to write the introduction to that book when it was republished. I remember sitting in a classroom at Temple University reading the Man Who Cried I Am for the first time and saying, I want to be a novelist. And saying to the instructor, Cyprian Lamar Rowe, at the time at Temple, I want to write, I want to be a novelist. And him saying, you already are, you just have to keep going, you just have to do it. And I want to be as good as John A. Williams. And he was like, you already are, you just have to show it. And then 20, or I don't know how many years later, when I get a chance to write the introduction to that book, I called John and I'm like, I just want you to know how much your life and your career meant to me. And well, before I talked to him, I talked to his wife, and she said, John really respects you and respects the work that you're doing. It was just like, wow. I mean, for a writer, this is all right. I mean, for me as a writer, this is all you want, is for somebody to say back to you, we appreciate, or I don't know, like your ability, your attempt to connect the dots between me and the next person, the next story, the next writer is an important thing. So Losing Absalom comes out of, in some ways, that drive to capture the life and the world of the family that I grew up in and the community I grew up in and the struggle that I faced. I always say that I probably would have written that book differently had it happened after the Million Man March that Farrakhan organized. Before that, and actually it hasn't materialized, the benefits of that I don't think ever really materialized, but before that, all I felt was desolation and despair. I grew up in inner city Philadelphia, North Philly, and the neighborhood that I grew up in was crumbling. Crack had taken over. It didn't really matter where all that was coming from, whether it was, the CIA or whatever people thought about that. Crack had sort of worked its way into my neighborhood and was killing everything, and you could just see it falling apart. So when I would go back home, I didn't feel like it was home anymore. The neighborhood was in despair. So I wrote Losing Absalom about that attempt to reclaim, or that desire to reclaim and build, because there's a part in Losing Absalom where I say my dad told me, your job is to get your education, get out of here. That was always the push. Get your education, get out of this neighborhood, because nothing good is going to happen to you here. Well, they were right. But what happens when everybody leaves? What happens when you go to college and you get your stuff and you go out? Well, it just leaves people who are struggling under pressure. Those are the people who have to figure out how to make it work, and it's hard. So strike moved from that moment to me in Minnesota. It's like, I remember my first trip here, I'm riding down 494, I'm going to Wayzata, and I'm like, whoa, what the hell is going on here? There are no buildings. You can see, I wrote an essay called The Unobstructed Eye, because it was like there was this moment, like I look straight, I could just keep looking. And I came here to work for a Fortune 500 company. I was in a corporate mode at that time. I had I hadn't really found my writing voice. I came into Minnesota culture, and I don't know, those of you who come from somewhere else for some period of time, you can't, it's just like, what is going on? People, you think, I don't want to be insulting at all, because I am now a Minnesotan. I probably do the same thing everybody. I thought people were like weird, but I'm weird now. It makes me think about being in the Navy when I got on my first ship. I came on this ship in the middle of the night in the Naples harbor, Naples, Italy, and I'm just fresh out of North Philly. We get off a boat, we climb up a Jacob's ladder, climb onto the ship. They direct us to the mess decks where the movie is playing, and all the sailors had been out to sea for 2 weeks. They had beers, they were throwing spitballs at each other. They were crazy, because that's what 2 weeks out to sea will do to you when you're with 350 other guys. And then 2 weeks later, I had a big beard and we were throwing spitballs. There's a certain way about coming to Minnesota where you don't, from North Philly, where you're talking fast, you want stuff, you think, and everything is just sort of calm, but really, if you're not paying attention, you will get got here just the same way. People are not weak. They're not, it's just it's different pace, a different energy, and it's indirect. A lot of communication is indirect. So, really? So when I thought back to my life in Philadelphia, and I also think about Henry Louis Gates in Figures of Life saying that the farther you are away from home, the clearer you see it. And I started to see my home for what it was. The struggle that my family was under, my sister, my mom, my dad, my friends, people being killed, the drug thing happening, the economic poverty, all that stuff was happening. And I realized I was incapable of having an impact on that. I could go back, but in some way I had already lost my relevance. And I wanted to capture that in Losing Absalom. So his absorption into the corporate culture, and then his dad gets sick, just like my dad got sick. And you go home, and you're forced to be there for a period of time. And it ate at me. And one of the things that I felt my dad gave me was the ability to tell that story. And in Losing Absalom, so the first part was, well, I sort of answered that. What was the second part of that question?
Just the way the neighborhood changing, and then this division between hope and not hope, and not having hope, and how
it's really hard to have hope in certain environments. You can't accuse people of being hopeless in a hopeless environment. And I would make the case that hope is the most valuable asset that each of us has. I want hope more than anything. Anything. I want to go to bed hoping that tomorrow will come and then it will be better. And so Sonny's sense that hope was possible in the face of all that, I thought was worth documenting. Of course, there was a way in which there was a way in which his hope was cut short. I don't want to get, you're not all going to run out and buy the book, so
you can
there
talk
is no
about it now.
spoiler here. But just at the moment when Sonny is about to make some resolution, he ends up in a situation he doesn't need to be in, and he's killed. Yeah, sorry, that was a true spoiler. But there is no other answer. That whole thing, you can't go home again. Well, you can go home again, but you may not leave. And sometimes he had to go back. His dad was dying, and he ends up in a room where there's a gun. He picks up the gun, and the person who didn't want to see somebody else with a gun pulled the trigger on him. And while the bullet is coming at him, he turns to his dad, who is in a coma, but who is next to him in that room, and he says, "I thought you told me it wasn't going to be like this." And his dad said, "We did the best we could. This is the way it is."
So what did you learn by that ending, by writing that ending?
I didn't learn anything. I learned that I don't need to be going home that much. I mean, our culture is really messed up. And you can, if we talk too long, I'm gonna be going off on how we try to make things look pretty and sound pretty and talk pretty, but there's a part of us that knows things are bad. Things were bad then anyway.
Yeah.
And hope, again, is the only balance to that.
So how do you hope in a situation like that?
You change your life. You take care of yourself. You try to grow. And then you give what you can give in that respect. Like, my message, unfortunately, for some people, I realize everybody wouldn't agree with this, but for me, this is about liberating each individual person separately and with a focused effort to liberate yourself from a cultural expectation so that your individuality can serve to save you, so you are free to save someone else. It's very difficult to get 10 people to order even the same pizza. And it's like I came up in the Black Power movement, been a cultural nationalist. I spent time on all areas of black political empowerment. And I see a lot of burnt out people. I see a lot of struggle, and I see a lot of frustration and bitterness. And I think bitterness is the absolute opposite of hope, and it has no place in a vibrant life. We should live vibrant lives. Every single one of us all the time. It shouldn't be this like heaviness that we can't breathe. We can't, it's like that's what my work now is about freeing as many of our children as I can or we can to have lives that are hopeful.